In the frozen wilderness of Echo Bay, Alaska, a quiet air traffic controller was about to challenge everything the military thought they knew about aerial defense. What started as routine radar monitoring took a shocking turn when she came face-to-face with foreign stealth drones infiltrating American airspace. Ray Navarro wasn't your typical tower technician. For 4 years, she had spent her life mastering tactical aviation systems and studying her deceased father's classified intelligence files, known for her uncanny ability to detect aircraft signatures that others dismissed as equipment glitches. When she encountered Vulture 3 reconnaissance drones systematically mapping U.S. defense installations, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military command. Ray's decision to secretly build and fly her own stealth interceptor from her father's encrypted blueprints would lead to the most significant counterintelligence operation in modern aviation history. What began as dismissed warnings from an overlooked woman would become a transformation that redefined aerial warfare doctrine. The frozen outpost of Echo Bay would never be the same after the ghost pilot they never saw coming proved that sometimes the most dangerous threats can only be stopped by those the system refuses to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ray Navarro had learned to disappear in plain sight. At 27, she possessed the kind of tactical brilliance that could track 17 aircraft simultaneously while calculating wind shear adjustments in her head, but in the Echo Bay control tower, she might as well have been invisible. The remote Alaskan airstrip, carved from permafrost during the Cold War and now serving as a forgotten military training outpost, suited her perfectly, a place where overlooked people handled overlooked airspace. "Navarro, you're on ground control again," Major Paul Grayson announced without looking up from his morning briefings. His voice carried the weary authority of a career officer who'd spent too many winters in places like Echo Bay, watching his contemporaries advance to warmer, more prestigious postings. "Keep the chatter minimal. We've got Coast Guard exercises inbound at 1400. Quote. Ray adjusted her headset and settled into the familiar rhythm of directing cargo planes and maintenance vehicles across the icy tarmac. Through the tower's reinforced windows, she watched a pair of F-16s taxi toward the runway, their engines creating heat mirages that danced against the white landscape. She knew the flight patterns of every aircraft that called Echo Bay home, could predict their fuel consumption and optimal approach vectors before the pilots even requested clearance. But ground control was where brilliant women were sent to stay quiet. "Ground, this is Cargo 77 requesting taxi clearance to Hangar 3, crackled through her headset. "Cargo 77, cleared to taxi via taxiway Alpha, hold short of runway 09, Ray responded, her voice steady and professional. She watched the lumbering transport plane lumber across the snow-packed asphalt, noting the slight hesitation in its left engine that suggested maintenance issues within the week. It was 1,347 hours when the anomaly appeared. Ray's radar screen flickered, registering a contact that shouldn't exist, too fast for civilian aircraft, too silent for military jets. The blip appeared at the edge of her scope for exactly 8 seconds, moving at what her instruments calculated as Mach 2.3 before vanishing completely. No transponder, no radio contact, no flight plan filed through any channel she could access. "Major Grayson," Ray called, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline spike. "I'm showing an unidentified contact, bearing 270. Estimated altitude 30,000 feet, speed approximately Mach 2.3. Grayson glanced at his primary radar display, which showed nothing but the scheduled Coast Guard helicopters approaching from the south. Negative contact on primary. Probably atmospheric interference. These old systems pick up ice crystals sometimes." Ray's jaw tightened. Her screen clearly showed the trace signature, a ghostly trail that her instruments had recorded for 8 full seconds. Ice crystals didn't maintain steady bearing and altitude while accelerating through Mach 2. "Sir, I'm confident this was an actual..." "Navarro." Grayson's tone carried a warning. "File a routine anomaly report and move on. We don't chase ghosts at Echo Bay." That night, Ray drove her battered Jeep Cherokee through the maze of abandoned hangars that dotted Echo Bay's perimeter. Most had been sealed since the base's transition from active military to joint training facility, their corrugated metal sides streaked with rust and decades of Alaskan weather. But Hangar 9, tucked behind a stand of skeletal birch trees, and obscured by snowdrifts, remained her secret. Inside, beneath tarps and surrounded by salvaged electronics, sat her obsession. The drone was sleek and angular, its carbon fiber skin matte black and nearly invisible even under the hangar's harsh fluorescent lights. Ray had built it from blueprints her father had hidden in encrypted files, specifications for an experimental aircraft that officially didn't exist. The project had consumed 3 years of her life, scavenging parts from decommissioned equipment, teaching herself avionics systems that weren't covered in any manual, and slowly, painstakingly bringing her father's ghost to life. "One more anomaly," she whispered to the silent aircraft, running her hand along its wing, "and they'll start listening." The second contact appeared 4 days later, during the early morning shift when Echo Bay's airspace was supposedly empty except for a routine weather reconnaissance flight. Ray watched her scope with the intensity of a hawk, having spent the intervening days fine-tuning her radar's sensitivity and expanding its search parameters beyond standard operating procedures. The blip materialized at 0623 hours, following almost the identical path as the first anomaly but flying lower, 25,000 feet instead of 30. This time, Ray was ready. She activated her recording systems and began tracking the contact manually, plotting its course on a paper chart while her instruments captured every detail. "Zeke," she called quietly to Isaiah Tran, the tower's tech support specialist who was hunched over a diagnostic computer in the corner. "I need you to look at something." Isaiah Zeke Tran was 24 years old, rail-thin, and possessed the kind of technical intuition that made him invaluable for maintaining Echo Bay's aging electronics. He'd been transferred from a classified satellite surveillance program after budget cuts, and Ray suspected his reassignment to this remote outpost was punishment for asking too many questions about what he'd been tracking. Zeke peered at Ray's screen, his thick-rimmed glasses reflecting the green glow of the radar display. "That's not supposed to be there." "No kidding. Can you pull the digital recordings from the past week? I want to check if this has been happening when I wasn't on shift." Major Grayson was across the tower, discussing flight schedules with the Coast Guard liaison, but Ray kept her voice low anyway. What she was asking Zeke to do wasn't technically against regulations, but it wasn't standard procedure either. Zeke's fingers danced across his keyboard with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, he'd accessed the tower's complete digital archives and begun running pattern analysis software that was definitely not part of Echo Bay's standard equipment. "Ray, this is weird. I'm showing similar signatures going back almost 3 months. Same speed profile, same altitude variations, same radio silence." Ray felt her pulse quicken. "Show me." The data painted a picture that made her blood run cold. The mysterious aircraft had been probing Echo Bay's airspace regularly, each incursion slightly different, as if testing response times and radar coverage. The flight path suggested detailed knowledge of military training schedules and blind spots in the surveillance network. "This pattern," Ray murmured, studying the plotted courses, "it's not random. It's reconnaissance." She pulled out her tablet and accessed the encrypted files her father had left, her gigabytes of technical specifications, mission reports, and aircraft designs that had been classified so deeply that most people who worked on them never knew what they were building. Among them was a designation that made her hands tremble: Vulture 3. The specifications matched: speed profile, radar signature, flight characteristics, everything aligned with an experimental drone her father had been tracking during his final mission. A mission that had ended with his death, and a cover-up so thorough that his own daughter had been told he died in a training accident. "Ray," Zeke's voice was tight with concern, "if this is what I think it is, we need to report it through official channels. This is way above our pay grade." Ray looked at the data one more time, then at Major Grayson across the tower. "I tried that already. They don't want to hear about ghosts." That afternoon, she requested a meeting with Grayson, bringing printed charts and digital analysis that should have convinced any reasonable military officer that Echo Bay was being systematically surveilled. Instead, she found herself facing a man whose career had taught him that unusual reports from junior personnel were usually wrong and always inconvenient. "Navarro, I've had enough of these phantom aircraft reports," Grayson said, barely glancing at her evidence. "You're spending too much time looking for problems that don't exist. Maybe it's time we moved you to a position with less creative interpretation required." "Sir, with respect, the data clearly shows." The data shows atmospheric anomalies and equipment glitches, nothing more. Grayson's tone was final. You're reassigned to communications monitoring effective immediately. Someone else can handle radar duties. As Ray walked back to her station, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, filtering out inconvenient truths and protecting the comfortable assumptions of people who'd never had to look beyond their predetermined conclusions. That night, in Hangar 9, she began preparing for war. The drone's engines purred to life at 0200 hours, their whisper-quiet operation barely audible above the Arctic wind that howled across Echo Bay's deserted runways. Ray had spent 6 weeks modifying every system, integrating her father's stealth technology with modern avionics scavenged from decommissioned aircraft. The result was something that shouldn't exist, a ghost machine built by a ghost woman to hunt another ghost. She'd named it Whisper. "Pre-flight check complete," she whispered into her throat mic, running through procedures she'd memorized from her father's notes. "All systems nominal. Beginning taxi sequence." The hangar's hidden runway was little more than a straight stretch of abandoned access road, but it was long enough for Whisper's needs. Ray had cleared it herself during late-night sessions, removing debris and marking hazards with reflective tape visible only through night vision equipment. Whisper rolled forward with barely a sound, its specially designed tires making no more noise than a whisper against the snow-packed surface. Ray's hands found their natural position on the controls, not the traditional stick and rudder of conventional aircraft, but a sophisticated fly-by-wire system that translated her intentions into precise electronic commands. "Tower to Ghost 1, came Zeke's voice through their private communication channel. He was working late shift in the tower, officially running diagnostic routines but actually providing overwatch for Ray's clandestine flight operations. "Airspace is clear. No scheduled traffic for the next 2 hours. "Copy, Tower. Ghost 1 is airborne." The moment of liftoff was pure magic. Ray felt Whisper rise into the star-filled darkness, its wings cutting through air so smoothly that she could barely sense the transition from ground to sky. This was what she'd dreamed of during those humiliating hours on ground control, the freedom of three-dimensional movement, the elegant dance of physics and intention that turned metal and fuel into flight. But tonight wasn't about joy. Tonight was about preparation. Ray flew a carefully planned route that avoided all known radar installations, following terrain features, and using Whisper's stealth characteristics to remain invisible to electronic surveillance. She practiced intercept maneuvers, emergency procedures, and the kind of high-G turns that would be necessary if she ever had to engage a hostile aircraft. The fear hit her during a particularly aggressive barrel roll, the same panic that had ended her dreams of conventional pilot training 5 years earlier. Her vision tunneled, her breathing became rapid and shallow, and for a terrifying moment she felt the aircraft slipping away from her control. The simulator washout that had redirected her career to air traffic control had been caused by exactly this kind of anxiety attack. But this time, she didn't have an instructor watching her fail. This time, she was alone in the darkness, with only her father's voice echoing in her memory. "Fear is just another instrument reading, Ray. Acknowledge it, understand what it's telling you, then fly anyway." She pulled out of the spin and leveled off, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The panic subsided, replaced by something harder and more focused. She wasn't the same person who'd washed out of flight school. That woman had been afraid of disappointing authority figures. This woman was authority, even if no one recognized it yet. "Ghost 1 returning to base," she radioed to Zeke. "Mission accomplished." Landing required even more precision than takeoff, threading Whisper through a narrow gap between radar coverage zones before setting down on her improvised runway. Ray taxied back to Hangar 9, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, feeling the aircraft cool around her. 3 days later, Captain Talia Rhodes arrived at Echo Bay. Ray first noticed her during the morning briefing, a Coast Guard officer with sharp eyes and the kind of confident posture that suggested someone accustomed to being listened to. She was leading a winter survival exercise for a joint training group, but Ray sensed something else, a watchfulness that reminded her of her own careful attention to details others missed. "Interesting radar signatures you've been logging," Talia commented casually during a coffee break, appearing beside Ray at the counter in the base cafeteria. I've been reviewing tower records as part of our exercise planning. Lots of atmospheric anomalies lately. Ray's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Standard weather interference. Nothing unusual. Right, weather. Talia's smile was knowing. I flew electronic warfare missions before transferring to the Coast Guard. I know what weather interference looks like on radar, and I know what doesn't. They stood in silence for a moment, two women surrounded by the casual chatter of male officers who'd never questioned whether their expertise was valued. Ray realized she was looking at someone who might understand the weight of being brilliant in a system designed to ignore brilliance in anyone who didn't fit the expected profile. Hypothetically, Ray said carefully, if someone were tracking unidentified aircraft in this airspace, what would be the proper reporting procedure? Hypothetically, you'd report it to your commanding officer, who would file it with Regional Air Command, who would probably classify it as a navigation error or equipment malfunction. Talia's voice was matter-of-fact. Unless you had proof that couldn't be dismissed. What kind of proof? Talia's smile was razor-sharp, the kind that requires getting close enough to see what you're really dealing with. That night, Ray made her decision. The next time Vulture 3 appeared in her airspace, she wouldn't just watch it disappear into the darkness. She would follow it, and she would get the proof that no one could ignore, even if it meant becoming the ghost they never saw coming. Captain Talia Rhodes possessed the kind of operational awareness that came from years of flying search and rescue missions in conditions that would ground most pilots. She noticed things. The way Ray Navarro's shift schedules seemed to align with equipment maintenance windows, how certain radar anomalies appeared in tower logs but never made it into official incident reports, and most tellingly, the faint smell of aviation fuel on Ray's jacket during conversations that took place hours after the last scheduled flight operations. You're burning midnight oil somewhere, Talia said, cornering Ray near the communications equipment room 3 days after her arrival at Echo Bay. I've been tracking the base's fuel consumption reports. Someone's been flying at night, off the books. Ray's expression remained carefully neutral, but Talia caught the micro-expression of calculation that flickered across her features, the same look she'd seen in covert operations briefings when someone was deciding how much truth they could afford to reveal. I run diagnostic tests on the tower equipment after hours, Ray replied. Some of the older systems require extended calibration cycles. Right. Equipment tests. Talia leaned against the wall, blocking Ray's easy exit from the narrow corridor. Funny thing about equipment tests, they don't usually leave contrail signatures at 15,000 feet, which is what I observed last night during my insomnia walk. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant hum of the base's heating system and the muffled sound of aircraft maintenance operations from the hangars. Ray was weighing her options, and Talia could see the exact moment when calculations shifted to decision. Hypothetically, Ray said, using the same careful phrasing from their earlier conversation, if someone were conducting unauthorized surveillance of potential security threats, what would your professional assessment be? Hypothetically, I'd want to know what kind of threats we're talking about. Talia's voice dropped to match Ray's conspiratorial tone. And I'd want to see the evidence. That night, Ray led Talia through the maze of abandoned hangars to the hidden runway, where Whisper sat under its camouflage netting. Talia's reaction was everything Ray had hoped for. Professional appreciation mixed with genuine awe as she examined the aircraft's stealth modifications and electronic warfare capabilities. This is military-grade technology, Talia whispered, running her hand along Whisper's wing. Where did you get the specifications? My father. Ray's voice carried years of buried grief. Lieutenant Colonel Eli Navarro. He was killed during a classified mission 5 years ago, supposedly a training accident, but his encrypted files tell a different story. Ray pulled out her tablet and showed Talia the intelligence her father had gathered on Vulture 3. Technical specifications, behavioral patterns, and most importantly, evidence that the experimental drone had been compromised and was now operating under hostile control. Jesus Christ, Talia breathed, studying the data. This thing has been mapping our defense installations for months. Why hasn't Command responded? Because they don't want to see it. Acknowledging the threat means acknowledging that their security protocols failed. Ray's frustration was evident in every word. Major Grayson treats me like I'm seeing things. Regional Command won't even review my reports. Talia understood immediately. She'd faced similar dismissals during her Coast Guard career, watching superior officers ignore inconvenient intelligence, rather than admit their assumptions might be wrong. The system was designed to protect itself, not necessarily the people it was supposed to serve. "So you built this to do what they won't," Talia said, gesturing at Whisper. "You're going hunting. Next time Vulture 3 appears, I'm going to intercept it. Get close enough for visual confirmation, maybe force it to alter course so Command can't ignore the incident." Ray's voice carried quiet determination. "Will you help me?" Talia looked at the sleek aircraft, then at the woman who'd built it from blueprints and determination. In her years of military service, she'd learned to recognize the moments when following orders meant failing the mission, when the chain of command became a chain that dragged everyone down. "What do you need?" The call came at 0347 hours, dragging Major Grayson from sleep with the urgent tone that meant something had gone seriously wrong. Colonel Ezra Blake's voice crackled through the secure phone line, carrying the kind of barely controlled panic that senior officers worked their entire careers to avoid displaying. "Grayson, we have a situation. Satellite surveillance detected an electromagnetic pulse event near your position approximately 6 hours ago. Someone dropped a data harvesting package in the Yukon testing range." Grayson was immediately awake, his mind racing through the implications. The Yukon range was where the military conducted its most sensitive electronics testing, including new radar systems and communication protocols that were vital to national security. A successful intelligence-gathering operation there could compromise years of technological development. "Sir, we had no unauthorized aircraft in our airspace." "My controller logs show—" "Your controller logs show what someone wanted them to show," Blake interrupted. "We have satellite thermal imaging of an unidentified aircraft operating in your sector. Small, fast, and invisible to your radar systems. This is a major security breach, Grayson, and it happened on your watch." The colonel's words hit like a physical blow. Grayson thought immediately of Ray Navarro's persistent reports about phantom aircraft, the anomaly data he'd dismissed as equipment glitches and overactive imagination. The sick feeling in his stomach told him exactly how catastrophically he'd misjudged the situation. "Sir, one of my controllers has been tracking similar signatures for weeks." "I should have. You should have reported it immediately instead of letting some junior technician chase shadows." Blake's tone was acid. "We're implementing Echo Protocol effective immediately. Total communications blackout except for command channels. No one talks to anyone outside the base until we understand the full scope of this breach." Echo Protocol was the nuclear option, complete information lockdown designed to prevent further intelligence leaks, while damage assessment teams tried to determine what had been compromised. Grayson had hoped never to implement it, knowing it would effectively isolate Echo Bay from the outside world and place every person on the base under suspicion. "Colonel, I need to brief my staff on—" "Your staff is now considered potentially compromised, especially anyone with access to radar systems or flight operations." Blake's meaning was clear. "I'm sending a security team to conduct interviews. Until then, no one operates aircraft, no one accesses communications equipment, and no one leaves the base." Ray received the news during the morning briefing, watching Grayson's face as he explained the lockdown procedures with the careful precision of a man trying to maintain control of a situation that had already spiraled beyond his ability to manage. She saw the guilt in his expression when his eyes briefly met hers, the recognition that he'd ignored warnings that might have prevented the current crisis. "All personnel are restricted to base until further notice," Grayson announced to the assembled staff. "External communications are suspended except for emergency channels. This is a security matter, and cooperation is mandatory." Zeke caught Ray's eye from across the room, his slight nod confirming what they both understood. Their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. If security investigators started examining communication logs and equipment access records, they would quickly discover the modifications Ray had made to the radar systems and the unauthorized data analysis she'd been conducting. More importantly, if Vulture 3 returned while Echo Bay was locked down and unable to respond, the consequences could be catastrophic. That evening, as the base settled into the tense quiet of enforced isolation, Ray made her final preparations. Whisper was fueled and ready, its systems tested and calibrated for the mission she'd been planning since the first anomaly appeared on her scope. She'd spent weeks studying Vulture 3's behavioral patterns, identifying the optimal interception points and planning contingencies for every scenario she could imagine. "This is insane," Zeke whispered as he helped her perform the pre-flight checks. If they catch you, it's not just court-martial. Blake will have you disappeared into some black site prison. If I don't stop that thing, it won't matter what Blake does to me, Ray replied, settling into Whisper's cockpit. Talia's monitoring communications. If Vulture 3 appears, she'll vector me to intercept. Ray started the engines and felt the familiar surge of power that meant the aircraft was ready for flight. Through her headset, she heard Talia's voice from the tower position she'd unofficially assumed. Ghost 1, this is Overwatch. Airspace is clear, but we have multiple radar contacts approaching from the north. Unknown configuration, estimated time to Echo Bay perimeter, 20 minutes. Ray's blood turned to ice water. This wasn't a single reconnaissance drone. This was a full-scale incursion. At 18,000 feet above the Alaskan wilderness, Ray Navarro finally understood what her father had died trying to stop. Vulture 3 wasn't alone. It was leading a formation of 3 identical aircraft, their radar signatures barely visible even to Whisper's enhanced detection systems. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military strike package, following waypoints that would take them directly over Echo Bay's most sensitive installations. Overwatch, Ghost 1 has visual contact on multiple hostiles, Ray transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Count 3 aircraft, advanced stealth configuration, bearing 045 toward the base. Talia's response crackled through the secure channel they'd established using Zeke's communication modifications. Copy, Ghost 1. Base radar shows nothing, but satellite thermal is confirming your contact. They're invisible to conventional systems. Ray adjusted Whisper's course to intercept the lead aircraft, knowing she had perhaps minutes before the formation reached Echo Bay's perimeter. Her father's notes had been clear about Vulture 3's capabilities. It was designed for intelligence gathering and electronic warfare, but it also carried defensive systems that could be lethal if provoked. The intercept geometry was perfect, allowing Ray to approach from the formation's blind spot while remaining hidden in their radar shadow. As she closed the distance, she could see details that no satellite or ground-based system could provide. The sleek, angular design that marked these aircraft as products of advanced military technology, the subtle variations in their electronic signatures that suggested they were operating under autonomous control. Ghost 1, be advised, Talia's voice carried new urgency. I'm detecting communication bursts from the lead aircraft. They're uploading data in real time. Ray realized with growing horror that the formation wasn't just conducting reconnaissance. They were actively stealing information from Echo Bay's electronic systems, using the base's own communication networks to transmit classified data to their controllers. Every second she delayed meant more security breaches, more compromised intelligence. She armed Whisper's defensive systems and moved to intercept. The moment she broke from the formation's radar shadow, everything changed. The lead aircraft immediately altered course, its passive sensors detecting Whisper's presence and identifying her as a threat. The other 2 aircraft separated, beginning evasive maneuvers that demonstrated sophisticated tactical programming. Ray found herself in a 3-dimensional chess match, played at supersonic speeds, with the stakes being national security and her own survival. Vulture 3's electronic warfare capabilities were formidable, attempting to jam her communications and corrupt her navigation systems, but her father's countermeasures held firm. They're adapting, she reported to Talia, pulling into a vertical climb to avoid a coordinated pincer movement. These things are learning my flight patterns in real time. The pursuit that followed tested every skill Ray had developed during her clandestine training flights. She used Whisper's superior maneuverability to force the hostile aircraft away from Echo Bay, engaging in a deadly game of cat and mouse that carried the formation over increasingly remote terrain. The breakthrough came when Ray managed to position herself directly behind the lead aircraft, close enough to trigger its defensive protocols. Instead of engaging her directly, Vulture 3 transmitted an abort signal to its wingman and began a high-speed withdrawal toward international airspace. Ray had 30 seconds to make a decision that would define the rest of her life. She could let the aircraft escape, preserving her secret but allowing the intelligence breach to continue. Or she could force a confrontation that would expose Whisper's existence and her own unauthorized activities. She thought of her father, of the classified mission that had killed him and the cover-up that followed. She thought of Major Grayson's dismissive attitude and Colonel Blake's willingness to ignore inconvenient truths. Most of all, she thought of the security breaches that were happening while the people responsible for preventing them refused to acknowledge the threat. Ray locked onto Vulture 3 and engaged her targeting systems. The electronic warfare barrage that followed lit up every sensor on both aircraft, creating electromagnetic signatures that would be visible to satellite surveillance and impossible to explain away as equipment malfunctions. Ray forced Vulture 3 into a series of increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers, herding it away from sensitive installations while maintaining enough pressure to prevent it from continuing its data theft operations. The chase ended when Vulture 3 finally crossed into international airspace and disappeared into the Arctic night, its mission incomplete and its electronic signature recorded by multiple surveillance systems. Ray turned Whisper toward home, knowing that her actions had just changed everything at Echo Bay. Ghost 1, return to base immediately. Talia's voice carried both relief and apprehension. We've got multiple satellite tracking stations asking questions, and Colonel Blake is demanding answers that we don't have. As Ray began her descent toward the hidden runway, she realized that her days as the invisible controller were over. She had become exactly what the situation demanded. The ghost pilot they never saw coming, the guardian who protected them from threats they refused to acknowledge. The question now was whether they would recognize her as a hero or court-martial her as a traitor. The arrest came at dawn, executed with the precise choreography of a military operation designed to minimize resistance and maximize psychological impact. Ray was walking from Hangar 9 after securing Whisper when 6 armed security personnel surrounded her, their movements coordinated through earpiece communications and practiced repetition. Ms. Navarro, by order of Colonel Blake, you are under arrest for violation of military security protocols, unauthorized operation of aircraft, and potential espionage activities, announced Captain Morris, the lead security officer whose crisp uniform and regulation haircut marked him as someone who'd never questioned an order in his life. You will come with us immediately. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ray raised her hands slowly, noting the positions of each officer and calculating her chances of escape. 0, she concluded. They'd been watching her far longer than she'd realized, probably since the moment satellite surveillance detected Whisper's electromagnetic signature during the aerial engagement with Vulture 3. I want to speak with Major Grayson, Ray said, her voice carrying the steady calm she'd learned from years of managing crisis situations in the control tower. Major Grayson is not available, Morris replied, producing flex cuffs from his tactical vest. Colonel Blake is conducting this investigation personally. Quote, the detention facility at Echo Bay consisted of 3 converted storage rooms in the basement of the administrative building, each equipped with basic furniture and monitored by closed-circuit cameras. Ray found herself in a windowless space that smelled of industrial disinfectant and bureaucratic desperation, wondering how many other inconvenient people had been stored here while their superiors decided what to do with them. She didn't have to wait long for answers. Colonel Ezra Blake arrived 6 hours later, accompanied by a stenographer and the kind of official bearing that came from decades of making careers disappear with carefully worded efficiency reports. At 58, Blake possessed the political survival instincts that had carried him through multiple administrations and budget cycles, always managing to emerge from controversies with his reputation enhanced rather than damaged. Ms. Navarro, Blake began, settling into the room's single chair while Ray remained standing. You've created quite a problem for me. Satellite surveillance recorded an unidentified aircraft engaging in combat maneuvers with foreign reconnaissance drones last night. The electromagnetic signatures were consistent with advanced stealth technology that officially doesn't exist. Ray remained silent, knowing that anything she said would be used to construct whatever narrative Blake needed to protect his own position. She'd studied his career during her research into her father's death, recognizing him as the intelligence officer who'd classified Lieutenant Colonel Eli Navarro's final mission, and buried the evidence of foreign drone infiltration that had cost her father his life. I'm prepared to offer you a choice, Blake continued, his tone suggesting he was granting her an enormous favor. You can sign a confession admitting to unauthorized use of military equipment for personal purposes, a misdemeanor that will result in dishonorable discharge and civilian prosecution. Or we can proceed with espionage charges that carry the possibility of life imprisonment. The stenographer's fingers moved mechanically across her keyboard, recording every word of the conversation that would determine Ray's future. Ray understood the game Blake was playing. He needed her confession to cover up his own failure to respond to the Vulture 3 threat, using her as a scapegoat while taking credit for resolving the security breach. "There's a third option," Ray said quietly. Blake's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm listening." "You could review the intelligence I've been gathering for the past 4 months and acknowledge that your refusal to investigate foreign reconnaissance activities has compromised national security." Ray's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from absolute certainty. "The aircraft I intercepted last night were conducting systematic intelligence gathering operations against U.S. military installations. My actions prevented a successful breach of classified testing data." "Your actions were unauthorized and potentially treasonous," Blake replied, but Ray caught the slight hesitation that suggested he'd already reviewed the satellite data and understood exactly how much damage Vulture 3 could have caused. The interrogation continued for 3 hours, with Blake attempting to construct a narrative that would minimize his own culpability while neutralizing Ray as a potential whistleblower. Ray responded to each question with precise technical details about Vulture 3's capabilities, the intelligence her father had gathered before his death, and the systematic security failures that had allowed foreign drones to operate in U.S. airspace for months without detection. By the end of the session, Blake's confidence had visibly eroded. Ray's detailed knowledge of classified drone technology and her father's intelligence files created complications that couldn't be resolved through simple scapegoating. More problematically, her interception of Vulture 3 had been recorded by multiple surveillance systems, providing evidence that her unauthorized actions had succeeded where official channels had failed. "We'll continue this discussion tomorrow," Blake announced, gathering his files with the careful precision of someone buying time to reassess a deteriorating situation. That evening, Ray received an unexpected visitor. Major Grayson appeared at her detention cell, looking like a man who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about his own judgment and leadership. He dismissed the guard and sat heavily in the visitor's chair, aging years in the hours since Ray's arrest. "I owe you an apology," Grayson said without preamble. "I reviewed your anomaly reports from the past 4 months. Everything you told me about foreign reconnaissance was accurate." Ray studied his face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with the professional embarrassment of an officer who'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. "What changed your mind?" "Satellite telemetry from last night's incident. Your ghost pilot, whoever they were, prevented what intelligence analysts are calling the most sophisticated espionage operation against U.S. military installations in the past decade." Grayson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Blake is trying to cover up his own failures by making you the villain, but the evidence doesn't support his narrative." "Then why am I still in detention?" "Because Blake has powerful friends who don't want to admit that a junior air traffic controller identified a security threat that senior intelligence officers missed for months." Grayson's tone carried years of frustration with the political realities of military bureaucracy. "But there are people in Washington who care more about results than protecting reputations." The next morning brought Captain Talia Rhodes, escorted by the same security team that had arrested Ray but clearly present as a witness rather than a prisoner. Talia's testimony provided crucial corroboration for Ray's version of events, describing the systematic intelligence gathering she'd observed and the technical sophistication of the foreign drone operations. "In my professional opinion," Talia concluded, addressing Blake with the kind of measured defiance that marked her as someone accustomed to challenging authority when necessary, "Ms. Navarro's actions prevented a major intelligence breach. Her unauthorized flight operations should be commendable, not punishable." Blake's response revealed the depth of his desperation. "Captain Rhodes, your opinion is noted but irrelevant. Military discipline requires protecting national security," interrupted a new voice from the doorway. Ray turned to see Brigadier General Sarah Martinez, a woman whose reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense had made her both feared and respected throughout the intelligence community. Her presence at Echo Bay meant that Ray's case had attracted attention at levels far above Blake's ability to control. "Colonel Blake," Martinez continued, her tone carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I'm here to review the intelligence breach at this facility and determine appropriate responses. Ms. Navarro, you're released pending further investigation." Quote. As Ray was escorted from the detention facility, she caught Blake's expression of barely controlled panic. The political calculus that had seemed so simple 12 hours earlier was rapidly becoming a career-threatening disaster, as higher authorities demanded explanations he couldn't provide without acknowledging his own failures. But Ray knew her troubles were far from over. General Martinez's intervention meant that her actions had attracted attention from the highest levels of military intelligence, creating opportunities for vindication or destruction, depending on how the final investigation concluded. The Pentagon briefing room where Ray found herself 3 days later bore no resemblance to the improvised detention facility at Echo Bay. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Potomac River, while screens displayed satellite imagery and technical specifications with the clinical precision of a surgical theater. She sat at a polished conference table surrounded by officials whose combined authority could reshape military policy with a single decision. General Martinez occupied the head position, flanked by intelligence analysts whose security clearances exceeded those of most cabinet members. Also present were representatives from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and a civilian contractor whose presence suggested commercial interests in whatever technology Ray had demonstrated during her unauthorized flights. "Ms. Navarro," General Martinez began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd spent decades evaluating complex security situations. "We're here to understand exactly what happened at Echo Bay and determine the appropriate response. I want you to start from the beginning and explain how you identified the foreign reconnaissance threat." Ray had prepared for this moment during the flight to Washington, organizing 4 months of intelligence gathering into a coherent narrative that demonstrated both the scope of the security breach and the systematic failures that had allowed it to continue. She began with her father's death and the classified files he'd hidden, explaining how Lieutenant Colonel Eli Navarro's final mission had provided the technical specifications for Vulture 3 and evidence of its compromise by hostile forces. "Your father was investigating similar drone incursions 5 years ago," observed Dr. Rebecca Chen, the DIA's senior technical analyst. "His death was attributed to equipment failure during a training exercise." "My father's death was caused by hostile action during an undisclosed mission to intercept Vulture 3, Ray replied, producing encrypted files from her tablet. "These are his personal logs, describing systematic reconnaissance activities and evidence that the experimental drone program had been compromised." His commanding officer at the time was Colonel Blake. The revelation created visible tension around the conference table. Ray watched as glances were exchanged between officials who understood the implications of what she'd just disclosed. If her father had been killed while investigating the same threat that Ray had intercepted, it suggested a cover-up that had allowed foreign intelligence operations to continue for years. General Martinez leaned forward, her expression sharpening with professional interest. "Show us what you built." Ray activated her tablet's presentation mode, displaying technical specifications for Whisper alongside video footage from her interception of the Vulture formation. The room fell silent as officials absorbed the reality of what she'd accomplished, building advanced stealth aircraft from classified blueprints and successfully engaging multiple hostile drones without official support or authorization. "This is extraordinary work," murmured the civilian contractor, studying Whisper's design modifications. "The integration of legacy stealth technology with modern avionics represents years of specialized engineering. Where did you acquire the technical expertise?" "Self-taught," Ray replied. "My father's files included complete technical specifications and operational procedures. I spent 3 years studying every system and 18 months building the aircraft." Dr. Chen pulled up satellite imagery from Ray's engagement with the Vulture formation, highlighting the electromagnetic signatures that had confirmed the foreign drone's presence. "Your intercept prevented what our analysts estimate would have been the largest intelligence breach in U.S. military history. The testing data those drones were attempting to steal included next-generation radar systems and communication protocols vital to national defense." "Which raises an important question," General Martinez interjected. "Why weren't these threats detected and addressed through official channels?" Quote, Ray had anticipated this question, knowing it would determine whether she was viewed as a problem to be contained or an asset to be protected. She pulled up months of incident reports, radar anomalies, and intelligence summaries that had been dismissed or buried by Echo Bay's command structure. "Major Grayson classified my reports as equipment malfunctions," Ray explained. "Colonel Blake refused to investigate foreign reconnaissance activities, preferring to maintain plausible deniability rather than acknowledge security failures under his command." The room's atmosphere shifted as officials realized they were looking at evidence of systematic negligence that had compromised national security. Blake's absence from the briefing suddenly seemed more significant. Ray suspected he was facing his own interrogation in a different room, attempting to explain how he'd ignored credible intelligence for months. "What are your recommendations for addressing this threat?" General Martinez asked. Ray had prepared for this question as well, understanding that her future depended on demonstrating not just the ability to identify problems but also to propose solutions. She outlined a comprehensive counterintelligence program that would use modified versions of Whisper's technology to detect and intercept foreign reconnaissance drones, combined with improved analysis procedures that would prevent similar intelligence failures. The key insight, Ray concluded, is that conventional radar systems cannot detect these advanced stealth drones. Defense requires specialized aircraft and sensors designed specifically for this threat. "My father understood this 5 years ago, but his warnings were ignored. We cannot afford to make the same mistake again." Dr. Chen studied the technical specifications with obvious fascination. "Would you be willing to lead the development of this counter-drone program?" Ray felt the weight of the moment, understanding that her answer would determine not just her own future, but potentially the direction of U.S. defense policy for years to come. She thought of her father's sacrifice, of the months she'd spent watching foreign drones operate freely in American airspace while officials refused to acknowledge the threat, and of the opportunity to transform from dismissed technician to recognized expert. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. General Martinez smiled for the first time during the briefing. "Excellent. We'll be establishing a new classified program based on your work, with you as the primary technical consultant. Colonel Blake will be reassigned to duties more suited to his capabilities." As the briefing concluded, Ray realized that her journey from overlooked air traffic controller to ghost pilot had ended with something she'd never expected: official recognition of her expertise, and the authority to implement the solutions she'd developed in secret. The invisible had finally become visible, but on her own terms rather than those imposed by a system that had tried to silence her. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd achieved visibility by becoming invisible, that her greatest triumph had come from operating outside the very system that now sought to embrace her contributions. 6 weeks after the Pentagon briefing, Echo Bay had been transformed from a forgotten outpost into the nerve center of a classified counterintelligence operation that would reshape aerial defense doctrine for decades. Ray stood in the renovated control tower, watching technicians install advanced radar systems designed specifically to detect stealth reconnaissance drones, while new aircraft sat in previously abandoned hangars awaiting deployment against threats that most people still didn't know existed. "Hard to believe this place was almost shut down last year," commented Zeke, adjusting the calibration on a sensor array that could track objects invisible to conventional surveillance. His transfer from tech support to senior systems engineer reflected the dramatic changes that had swept through Echo Bay's organizational structure. "Now we're the most important base nobody's allowed to talk about." Ray nodded, studying the status displays that showed the positions of friendly aircraft conducting training exercises across thousands of square miles of Alaskan airspace. The Ghost Squadron, as it had been unofficially designated, consisted of 12 modified aircraft based on Whisper's design, each flown by pilots specifically selected for their ability to operate independently in ambiguous situations. "Contact bearing 270, altitude 15,000, speed Mach 1.8, reported Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the primary radar station. Kim was one of 6 new controllers who'd been recruited specifically for the Ghost Squadron mission, each possessing the kind of analytical instincts that conventional military training often discouraged. "Signature matches known reconnaissance profile. Scramble Ghost 3 and Ghost 7, Ray ordered, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had replaced her former invisibility. "Intercept and identify. Do not engage unless threatened." The response was immediate and coordinated, with 2 stealth aircraft launching from concealed runways, while satellite surveillance provided real-time intelligence on the approaching contact. Ray watched the intercept develop on multiple screens, noting the precision with which her pilots executed maneuvers she'd pioneered during her solitary flights above the Arctic wilderness. Captain Talia Rhodes' voice crackled through the communication system from the cockpit of Ghost 3. "Control, this is Ghost 3. Visual contact with unknown aircraft. Configuration matches Vulture-class reconnaissance drone, but the electronic signature is different. This might be a new variant." Ray felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the discovery of new threats. The Vulture program had apparently continued development despite the loss of 3 aircraft during her original intercept, with foreign manufacturers creating improved versions designed to counter the defensive measures she'd helped implement. Ghost 3, maintain visual contact and collect full-spectrum analysis, Ray instructed. Ghost 7, position for coordinated intercept if the contact attempts to withdraw. The engagement that followed demonstrated both the effectiveness of Ray's training program and the evolving nature of the threat they faced. The new Vulture variant possessed enhanced electronic warfare capabilities and improved maneuverability, requiring sophisticated countermeasures to force it away from sensitive installations. Ray's pilots adapted in real time, using tactics she'd developed through months of studying her father's intelligence files and her own combat experience. Contact is withdrawing toward international airspace, reported Ghost 7. Electronic intelligence package captured. This bird was definitely mapping our new installations. Ray authorized the pilots to return to base, knowing that the captured intelligence would provide vital information about foreign reconnaissance capabilities while demonstrating the continued need for the Ghost Squadron program. Each successful intercept validated her approach and strengthened her position within the defense establishment, transforming her from unauthorized operator to indispensable expert. Later that evening, Ray found herself in Hangar 9, now redesignated as the Ghost Squadron's primary maintenance facility. Whisper sat in the center position, surrounded by the newer aircraft that represented the evolution of her father's original vision. The hangar buzzed with activity as technicians prepared aircraft for night operations while engineers analyzed intelligence gathered during the day's intercepts. "Impressive setup," observed a familiar voice from behind her. Ray turned to find Major Grayson approaching, his uniform bearing the new insignia that marked him as the Ghost Squadron's executive officer. His promotion had surprised many observers, but Ray understood that his willingness to admit his mistakes and support her programs had demonstrated the kind of leadership qualities the new mission required. "Any regrets about not being up there yourself?" Grayson asked, gesturing toward the aircraft being prepared for launch. Ray considered the question, thinking about her transformation from invisible controller to visible commander. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Flying is still the purest form of freedom I know. But this is more important than personal satisfaction." Through the hangar's open doors, she could see the lights of Echo Bay's expanded facilities, stretching across what had once been empty wilderness. The base now housed 3 squadrons of specialized aircraft, an intelligence analysis center that operated around the clock, and training facilities that prepared the next generation of pilots for threats most people couldn't imagine. "Your father would be proud," Grayson said quietly. Ray felt the weight of inherited responsibility and chosen duty, understanding that her success honored not just her father's memory, but also the principle that competence should be recognized regardless of who possessed it. The system that had once dismissed her warnings now sought her guidance, but she'd learned to measure victory not by recognition, but by results. "Ghost 1 to tower," came Talia's voice through the communication system. "Ready for night patrol. All systems nominal." Ray walked to the control position and picked up her headset, feeling the familiar comfort of coordinating aircraft movements and tactical operations. She was no longer the quiet one in the tower, no longer invisible to those who made decisions about national security. But she'd retained the qualities that had made her effective: careful attention to detail, willingness to see threats others missed, and the determination to act when action was required. "Ghost 1, you are cleared for takeoff," Ray transmitted. "Vector 270, altitude flight level 250, watch for new contact patterns in grid 7. As Talia's aircraft disappeared into the star-filled darkness, Ray realized that her journey from dismissed technician to recognized expert represented more than personal vindication. She'd demonstrated that brilliance could emerge from unexpected places, that the system's tendency to overlook unconventional people was both a weakness and an opportunity. The ghost pilot they'd never seen coming had become the visible guardian they'd never known they needed, protecting skies that most people assumed were already safe. And in the process, she'd proven that sometimes the most important victories were won by those who refused to remain invisible, when visibility meant the difference between security and catastrophe. The sky remembered those who dared it, and Ray Navarro had claimed her place among the legends. 18 months after the Pentagon debrief that changed everything, Ray Navarro stood in the command center she'd designed from scratch, watching the morning briefing unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd built an empire from whispered warnings and midnight engineering sessions. The transformed Echo Bay bore no resemblance to the forgotten outpost, where she'd once directed cargo planes across empty tarmac, while superior officers dismissed her expertise as overactive imagination. Current threat assessment shows elevated reconnaissance activity along the Pacific Northwest corridor, reported Major Chen, the intelligence analyst whose arrival had marked Echo Bay's evolution from backwater posting to critical national asset. Satellite surveillance detected 3 separate incursions over the past 72 hours, all matching Vulture-class signature profiles, but with enhanced stealth characteristics. Quote, Ray studied the tactical display that dominated the command center's main wall, its holographic projections showing aircraft positions, threat vectors, and intercept probabilities, with the precision of a 3-dimensional chess game played across thousands of square miles of contested airspace. The technology represented years of development based on principles she'd discovered while analyzing her father's encrypted files in a basement office where nobody expected brilliance to emerge. Ghost Squadron status? Ray asked, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had replaced her former invisibility. 12 aircraft operational, 4 on ready alert, 8 conducting training exercises, responded Captain Rodriguez, the squadron operations officer whose own journey from dismissed technician to recognized expert paralleled Ray's transformation. Lieutenant Commander Rhodes is leading advanced intercept training in Sector 7, working with the new pilots on stealth engagement protocols. Ray nodded, feeling pride in the program that had grown from her solitary flights above the Arctic wilderness into a comprehensive defense network. Talia's promotion to training commander reflected the recognition that unconventional warfare required unconventional leaders, people who understood that the most effective strategies often emerged from those the system had initially overlooked. "Ma'am," interrupted Lieutenant Kim, approaching with a tablet containing personnel files and qualification assessments, "we have a situation that requires your personal attention. A new recruit has requested assignment to the Ghost Squadron program, but her background raises some interesting parallels to your own experience." Ray accepted the tablet, scanning the military record of Second Lieutenant Maria Santos with the careful attention she brought to all potential threats and opportunities. What she found confirmed Kim's assessment. Santos possessed the kind of tactical brilliance that conventional training programs often failed to recognize, combined with the pattern of institutional dismissal that Ray knew intimately. 3 failed pilot training attempts, Ray murmured, reading through evaluation reports that praised Santos's technical knowledge while questioning her emotional stability under pressure. Anxiety disorders during simulator testing, classified as unsuitable for combat operations. Sound familiar? Quote, Kim smiled with the knowing expression of someone who'd witnessed Ray's own transformation from dismissed controller to indispensable expert. Her instructors describe her as too introspective, lacking the aggressive confidence profile required for modern fighter operations. But her scores on tactical analysis and systems integration are literally off the charts. Ray continued reading, noting the familiar pattern of excellence being dismissed because it didn't conform to expected behavioral norms. Santos had scored in the top 1% of her academy class on every technical examination, while being consistently rated as unsuitable for operational assignments due to her quiet demeanor and tendency to overthink complex scenarios. Schedule her for a personal interview, Ray decided. Today, if possible. And pull her complete academic records. I want to see what she was working on during her independent study projects. The afternoon brought Santos to Ray's office, a spartanly furnished space that reflected its occupant's preference for function over ceremony. The young officer stood at attention with the rigid posture of someone who'd spent years being told she wasn't quite right for the roles she desperately wanted to fill, her dark eyes reflecting intelligence that had been systematically undervalued by people who confused conformity with competence. "At ease, Lieutenant," Ray said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I've reviewed your file. Tell me about your independent research into autonomous threat recognition systems." Santos relaxed slightly, her formal military bearing giving way to the enthusiasm that emerged when she discussed technical subjects that captured her imagination. "Ma'am, my thesis focused on using artificial intelligence to identify hostile aircraft that conventional radar systems can't detect. The premise was that stealth technology creates distinctive electromagnetic signatures that are invisible to standard sensors but recognizable to properly trained neural networks. Ray leaned forward, recognizing the same analytical approach that had led her to identify Vulture 3's reconnaissance patterns months before official channels acknowledged the threat. What were your conclusions? That most military surveillance systems are designed to find expected threats rather than unexpected ones, Santos replied with growing confidence. Hostile aircraft using advanced stealth technology become invisible, not because they can't be detected, but because our detection systems aren't programmed to recognize their signatures. It's a software problem disguised as a hardware limitation. The assessment was both accurate and insightful, demonstrating exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that Ray had learned to value above traditional qualifications. Santos possessed the intellectual curiosity and analytical flexibility that made effective ghost pilots, qualities that rigid training programs often discouraged in favor of predictable responses to predetermined scenarios. "Why do you want to join the Ghost Squadron?" Ray asked. Santos hesitated, then spoke with the honesty of someone who'd learned that pretending to be conventional was both exhausting and ineffective. Because conventional pilot training is designed for conventional threats, and conventional threats aren't what keep me awake at night. I've spent 4 years studying aerospace engineering and tactical analysis, and everything I've learned suggests that the next war will be fought by pilots who think differently, not just fly faster. Ray smiled, remembering her own frustrations with systems that rewarded conformity while dismissing innovation. What makes you think you can handle the psychological pressure of solo operations in contested airspace? Because I've been flying solo my entire career, Santos replied. Every technical project, every strategic analysis, every attempt to contribute something meaningful to military operations, I've been doing it alone, while people who were supposed to be my teammates treated me like I was broken rather than different. The interview continued for another hour, covering technical subjects, tactical scenarios, and personal motivations with the thoroughness Ray brought to all decisions that might affect operational effectiveness. By the end, she was convinced that Santos represented exactly the kind of unconventional talent the Ghost Squadron needed to address evolving threats. "Report to Hangar 9 tomorrow at 0600, Ray instructed. "You'll begin training immediately on modified stealth systems. Fair warning, our approach to pilot development doesn't follow conventional protocols. We're more interested in teaching you to think than to react." That evening, Ray found herself in Hangar 9, now designated as the Ghost Squadron's primary operations facility. The space that had once hidden her secret project now bustled with legitimate activity, as technicians prepared aircraft for night missions, while engineers analyzed intelligence gathered during daylight reconnaissance flights. Whisper sat in its accustomed position at the center of the hangar, surrounded by the newer aircraft that represented the evolution of her father's original vision. The prototype remained her preferred mount for the most sensitive operations, its systems fine-tuned through months of combat experience and continuous improvement. "Planning another solo mission?" asked Talia, approaching from the flight line where she'd been conducting post-flight inspections with her training squadron. "Thinking about legacy," Ray replied, studying the aircraft that had transformed her from invisible technician to visible commander. "Santos reminds me of myself 2 years ago. Brilliant, dismissed, and dangerous in all the ways that matter." Talia nodded with understanding born from her own experience of challenging institutional assumptions and paying career consequences for being right when authority figures preferred to be comfortable. "Think she'll make it through training?" "I think she'll redefine what training means," Ray said, "just like we did." The next morning brought the first phase of Santos's integration into the Ghost Squadron program, beginning with theoretical instruction in stealth technology and electronic warfare systems. Ray personally conducted the initial briefings, sharing insights that had been developed through years of studying her father's classified research and her own combat experience. Traditional pilot training focuses on aircraft performance and weapons systems, Ray explained to Santos and the 3 other new recruits who'd been selected for the program. Ghost Squadron training focuses on thinking, how to analyze threats that others can't see, how to develop solutions that don't exist in any manual, and how to operate effectively when official support isn't available. The training progression that followed was unlike anything offered at conventional military schools, emphasizing independent analysis and innovative problem-solving over standardized responses to predetermined scenarios. Ray had designed the curriculum based on her own transformation from dismissed controller to recognized expert, understanding that unconventional challenges required unconventional preparation. Santos excelled immediately. demonstrating the same analytical instincts that had led Ray to identify foreign reconnaissance patterns months before official channels acknowledged the threat. During simulated intercept exercises, she developed tactics that combined stealth technology with psychological warfare, using electronic signatures to confuse hostile aircraft while remaining invisible to conventional detection systems. "She's got it," Talia observed after watching Santos execute a particularly complex training scenario. "That combination of technical knowledge and tactical creativity that makes someone dangerous in the right ways." Ray agreed, noting how Santos approached each exercise with the methodical precision of an engineer combined with the adaptive flexibility of someone who'd learned to succeed despite systematic discouragement. The young officer represented the next generation of ghost pilots, inheriting principles that Ray had developed while creating entirely new approaches to challenges that conventional training couldn't address. 3 months into Santos's training program, Echo Bay received its most significant test since Ray's original intercept of the Vulture formation. Satellite surveillance detected a coordinated reconnaissance operation involving 6 advanced stealth aircraft operating along the Canadian border, their flight patterns suggesting preparation for a major intelligence-gathering mission against critical defense installations. "This is different," Ray observed, studying the tactical display in the command center. "Previous incursions have been individual aircraft conducting opportunistic surveillance. This represents systematic preparation for something larger." Major Chen nodded grimly. "Intelligence analysis suggests they're mapping response times and defensive capabilities in preparation for a major operation. We could be looking at the preliminary phase of a coordinated attack on North American defense infrastructure." Ray felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied moments when theoretical preparation met operational reality. The Ghost Squadron had been created specifically to address threats that conventional military systems couldn't handle, and this situation represented exactly the kind of challenge she'd been preparing for since her first unauthorized flight above the Arctic wilderness. "Scramble all available aircraft," Ray ordered. "Full squadron deployment, maximum stealth configuration. I'll lead the intercept personally." 30 minutes later, Ray was airborne in Whisper, leading 11 other ghost pilots toward what intelligence analysis suggested was the most sophisticated foreign reconnaissance operation ever attempted against North American airspace. The formation flew in complete electronic silence, using encrypted communication protocols that Ray had developed based on her father's research into covert operations. "Contact bearing 045, estimated 6 aircraft in coordinated formation," reported Ghost 7, Santos's voice carrying the calm professionalism that marked her as someone who'd found her natural element in situations that would overwhelm conventional pilots. Ray smiled despite the tension, recognizing in Santos's tone the same quiet confidence she'd developed during her own transformation from overlooked controller to indispensable expert. The young officer had absorbed everything Ray could teach her and was now creating her own innovations, exactly as the training program had been designed to encourage. The engagement that followed demonstrated both the effectiveness of Ray's training methods and the evolving sophistication of the threats they faced. The hostile aircraft possessed capabilities that exceeded previous Vulture-class drones, requiring coordinated countermeasures and adaptive tactics that couldn't be found in any standard manual. Ray's squadron responded with the fluid precision of a team that had learned to think collectively while operating individually, each pilot contributing unique insights while maintaining formation discipline. The intercept succeeded in forcing the hostile aircraft to abort their mission and withdraw toward international airspace, but not before capturing intelligence that revealed the scope of the threat they'd prevented. "Analysis confirms this was reconnaissance preparation for a major electronic warfare operation," Major Chen reported during the post-mission debrief. "Without our intervention, they would have gathered sufficient intelligence to conduct coordinated attacks on 3 critical defense installations." Ray nodded, understanding that the successful intercept represented validation of everything she'd built at Echo Bay. The Ghost Squadron had evolved from her secret hangar project into a comprehensive defense capability that protected installations most Americans didn't know existed from threats most officials refused to acknowledge. "Outstanding work, all aircraft," Ray transmitted to her pilots. "This is what we trained for. Protecting people who don't know they need protection from threats they can't see coming." Later that evening, as the celebration in the officers' club continued around her, Ray found herself standing alone on the observation deck, where she'd first planned her transformation from invisible controller to visible guardian. The lights of Echo Bay stretched across what had once been empty wilderness, representing the infrastructure of a program that had grown from whispered warnings into recognized expertise. No regrets? Asked Talia, joining her at the railing with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable companionship of someone who'd shared the journey from dismissal to recognition. Ray considered the question, thinking about her evolution from the quiet one in the tower to the commander whose innovations had become doctrine. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of being underestimated, she admitted. There was freedom in being invisible, in knowing that my only responsibility was to be right. And now? Now I'm responsible for being right on behalf of people who depend on me to see threats they can't imagine. Ray sipped her coffee, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility and chosen duty. It's harder, but it's worth it. Through the window, she could see Santos conducting post-flight maintenance on her aircraft, with the meticulous attention to detail that marked her as someone who understood that excellence required constant effort. The young officer represented the future of the Ghost Squadron, carrying forward principles that Ray had developed while creating entirely new approaches to challenges that hadn't existed when the program began. Think she'll surpass us? Talia asked, following Ray's gaze. I hope so, Ray replied. That's what legacy means. Creating something that grows beyond what you could accomplish alone. As the evening shift took over Echo Bay's operations, Ray walked one final time through Hangar 9, checking on aircraft that had become both tools and symbols of her transformation, from dismissed technician to recognized expert. Whisper sat in its familiar position, ready for whatever missions the future might bring, its systems carrying the combined innovations of 2 generations of ghost pilots. On the maintenance log, Santos had left a note in precise handwriting, all systems optimal. Ready for anything the sky remembers to throw at us. Ray smiled, recognizing her own words reflected back with the confidence of someone who'd found her place in a profession that had initially rejected her. The cycle was complete. The ghost pilot they'd never seen coming had become the visible mentor who ensured the next generation would be ready for threats that didn't yet exist. In a world full of noise, the quietest voices had finally found their frequency, creating harmony from the discord of underestimation and proving that sometimes the most important battles were won by those who refused to remain invisible, when visibility meant the difference between security and catastrophe. The sky remembered those who dared it, and Ray Navarro had claimed her place among the legends while ensuring that others would follow in her contrails, carrying the light of recognition into the darkness of institutional blindness. Her father's insignia gleamed on her collar as she turned off the hangar lights, a reminder that some legacies were worth inheriting and some traditions were worth transforming. Tomorrow would bring new threats and new opportunities, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that the system she'd once fought against now depended on the very qualities it had tried to suppress. The ghost had become the guardian, and the guardian had become the guide, ensuring that brilliance would be recognized regardless of who possessed it, and that the sky would always remember those brave enough to claim it. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.